A single envelope can hold enough explosive power to level an empire. Sebastian Falcone, the ruthless head of the Houston Syndicate, thought he had buried his past. But a letter delivered 5 years too late just revealed a secret so devastating, it threatens to burn his entire world to the ground. The rain in Houston hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sebastian Falcone's penthouse office. It distorted the glittering skyline into a blurry sea of neon and shadows. At 34, Sebastian was the undisputed king of the city's underground. He controlled the ports, the unions, and the politicians. He was a man made of cold calculations and polished granite. He was devoid of the vulnerabilities that got men in his position killed. But every fortress has a weak point. For Sebastian, that weakness had a name, Madeleine Hayes. Madeline had been dead for exactly 5 years. Her death was a fiery car crash on Interstate 55. It had severed the last tether keeping Sebastian's humanity intact. After her funeral, he had turned the city inside out, suspecting a hit. But the police and his own investigators concluded it was a tragic accident. She was fleeing the city in the dead of night. She packed nothing but a duffel bag, leaving him without a word of explanation. For 5 years, Sebastian lived with the bitter assumption that she had finally been terrified by his world and tried to escape him. The heavy oak door to his office clicked open, breaking his reverie. Second in command, Vincent, stepped in. Vincent was a massive, scarred man who rarely showed emotion. But tonight, he looked deeply uneasy. "Boss," Vincent rumbled, his voice gravelly. "There's a lawyer downstairs. His name is Richard Caldwell from Caldwell and Finch Estate Planners." Sebastian didn't turn from the window. "I don't take unannounced meetings, Vince. You know that. Send him away. If he pushes, break his jaw." "I tried to send him packing," Vincent replied, shifting his weight. "But he said he's executing a blind trust. And he said it's from Madeline." Sebastian froze. The tumbler of scotch in his hand stopped midway to his lips. For a long, agonizing second, the only sound in the room was the drumming of the rain against the glass. He slowly turned around, his dark eyes narrowing into lethal slits. "Bring him up," Sebastian ordered, his voice dangerously soft. "Now." Moments later, Richard Caldwell was ushered into the office. He was a balding man in his late 50s. He was wearing a damp trench coat and clutching a metal lockbox to his chest as if it were a shield. He was trembling. Anyone in their right mind trembled when summoned to Sebastian Falcone's inner sanctum. "Mr. Falcone," Caldwell stammered, swallowing hard. "I apologize for the intrusion. I assure you I'm only acting as a fiduciary. I was legally bound by the terms of an escrow agreement to deliver this to you tonight." "Tonight?" Sebastian stepped forward. His imposing frame cast a long shadow over the lawyer. 5 years after she died. "That was the exact stipulation, sir," Caldwell said. He frantically entered a combination into the lockbox. It popped open with a metallic click. "The client, Miss Madeleine Hayes, visited my office 5 years ago, 1 week before her passing. She paid a substantial retainer in cash. The instruction was that if she didn't return to claim this envelope within exactly 5 years, I was to hand-deliver it to you personally. Not a day sooner, not a day later." Caldwell reached into the box and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with red wax, bearing the imprint of a simple rose, Maddie's favorite flower. Sebastian's breath hitched. He snatched the envelope from the lawyer's trembling hands. The paper felt heavy. Across the front was his name, Sebastian. It was written in the elegant, looping cursive he had memorized from 100 grocery lists and bedside notes. "Get out," Sebastian whispered, his eyes locked on the handwriting. Vincent grabbed Caldwell by the elbow and hauled the terrified lawyer out of the office. He shut the heavy oak doors behind them. Sebastian stood alone in the center of the room. His hands, which had steadily held a gun to men's heads without a tremor, were shaking. He broke the wax seal. Inside were several pages of thick stationery and a smaller secondary envelope tucked into the back. He unfolded the papers, sat heavily in his leather chair, and began to read. "October 14th. My dearest Dom, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means 5 years have passed. I forced the lawyer to wait this long because I needed time. I needed the dust to settle, and I needed the monsters in your world to think they had won. By now, the trail is cold, and you're finally safe. I know you, Dom. I know you thought I ran away from you. I know you probably hated me for leaving that night without saying goodbye. But I didn't run from you. I ran for you. And I ran for him." Sebastian stopped reading. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. "Him?" He forced his eyes back to the page, his vision blurring slightly. "I was going to tell you the night of the gala at the Drake Hotel. Remember that night? You were wearing that charcoal suit, and you smiled at me. That real smile you only ever kept for me. I had the ultrasound in my purse. I was 9 weeks pregnant." A strangled sound escaped Sebastian's throat. He dropped the letter onto the desk, pushing himself back as if the paper had caught fire. Pregnant. Madeline had been pregnant. He was going to be a father. The realization hit with the force of a freight train. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and leaned forward to continue reading. The letter continued, each word tearing away the fabric of the reality Sebastian had known for the past 5 years. "I was so happy, Dom. But before I could show you the picture, your Uncle Albert pulled me aside into the conservatory." Sebastian's blood turned to ice. Albert Falcone, the man who had raised him in the syndicate. The man who had supposedly stepped down due to failing health and allowed Sebastian to take the throne. Albert had died of a stroke 3 years ago, leaving this world peacefully in his sleep. Albert knew. I don't know how, but he knew about the baby. He locked the conservatory doors. He didn't yell. You know how cold he could be. He handed me a file. Inside were photos of you, Dom. Photos of you meeting with the heads of the Rossi family. Photos of your private bank accounts. Documents that would have sent you to federal prison for the rest of your life. He told me that you were becoming too soft, too distracted by me. He said that in this life, love is a liability and a child is a death sentence. He gave me an ultimatum, Dom. He said if I stayed, he would hand those files to the feds, and then he would have you killed in prison. He had the guards on his payroll. I saw the proof, but that wasn't the worst part. He looked at my stomach and told me that if I didn't vanish that very night, my baby wouldn't live to take its first breath. He threatened our child, Sebastian. Sebastian let out a roar. It was a primal, guttural sound of pure agony and rage. He grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from his desk and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, raining glass and amber liquid over the Persian rug. Albert, his own flesh and blood, the man he had mourned, the man whose eulogy he had spoken, had chased away the love of his life and threatened his unborn child. Vincent burst through the doors, his hand on his weapon, scanning the room for threats. "Boss, what is it?" Sebastian held up a shaking hand, his chest heaving. "Stay," he commanded, his voice raw. "Just stand there." He looked back down at the letter. I had no choice. I couldn't let him hurt you, and I couldn't let him touch our baby. So I packed a bag and left. I drove toward Springfield, crying the entire way. But Dom, I didn't die in that crash. Sebastian stopped breathing. He read the sentence again. I didn't die in that crash. Albert sent men after me. I realized I was being followed on Interstate 55. A black SUV tried to run me off the road. I managed to pull off into a rest stop, abandoning the car. I hid in the woods. I watched them pour gasoline on my car and set it on fire. I knew they would need a body. So I broke into a nearby dental clinic the next town over days later. I swapped my dental records with a Jane Doe who had died in the county morgue. It was desperate, but it worked. Albert thought I was dead. You thought I was dead. I changed my name. I became Sarah Jenkins, and 6 months later our son was born. His name is Leo. He has your eyes. He's the most beautiful thing in this world. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, spilled over Sebastian's eyelashes and fell onto the expensive stationery. A son. He had a 5-year-old son named Leo. I'm writing this from a hospice bed in Oregon. By the time you read this, cancer will have done what Albert's men couldn't. I'm dying, Sebastian. That's why I set the timer for 5 years. I needed to ensure Albert was out of the picture, and I needed you to be completely in control of the family before you found out. But here is the truth, Dom. Albert had loyalists. His old enforcer, Thomas the Butcher Greco, found out I was still alive 3 months ago. I don't know how, but he tracked me to Oregon. Greco is quietly hunting for Leo. I had to send Leo away. Look in the smaller envelope. Sebastian's frantic fingers tore open the smaller envelope. Inside was a Polaroid photograph and a single brass key. He looked at the photo. It was a little boy with a shock of dark hair and intense, serious brown eyes. Eyes that mirrored Sebastian's own, staring back at him from the mirror every morning. The boy was holding a stuffed bear, standing in front of a modest suburban house. On the back of the photo, Madeline had written, "He's with my sister, Chloe. She doesn't know who you really are, but she knows to hide him. Find them, Sebastian. Greco is closing in. Protect our son." Sebastian slowly lowered the photo. The grief that had paralyzed him for 5 years evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifying wrath. The ghost of Madeleine Hayes had reached out from the grave, not just to clear her name, but to hand him a war. He looked up at Vincent. The second in command was staring at his boss, alarmed by the sudden, deadly shift in Sebastian's demeanor. The broken man was gone. The Mafia boss had returned, but now he had a purpose. "Vincent," Sebastian said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Yeah, boss. Lock down the city. Ground every private jet, watch every train station, and put eyes on every tollway. I want every single man who was ever loyal to Albert Falcone rounded up and brought to the warehouse on 4th Street. Vincent's eyes widened. "Boss, that's dozens of guys. Some of them are capos now. It'll start a civil war." Sebastian stood up, buttoning his suit jacket over his holster. The storm raged violently outside, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside the room. "I don't care if it burns Houston to the ground," Sebastian stated, his eyes dark and empty of anything but violence. "Find Thomas Greco and get a jet ready for Portland, Oregon. We're going to find my son." The Gulfstream G650 tore through the midnight sky, hurtling toward Portland, Oregon. Inside the dimly lit cabin, Sebastian Falcone sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the Polaroid of his son. The brass key rested in the center of his palm, its cold metal biting into his skin. Beside him, Vincent was methodically disassembling and cleaning a pair of Glock 19s. The rhythmic click-clack of the slide was the only sound competing with the hum of the jet engines. Back in Houston, the purge had already begun. Sebastian had given the order before the wheels left the tarmac. His most loyal enforcers were currently systematically hunting down the remnants of his Uncle Albert's regime. Safe houses were being raided, offshore accounts frozen, and men who thought they were untouchable were suddenly vanishing into the shadows of the city. Sebastian was burning his own empire to the ground to ensure there would be no one left to threaten his boy. "Boss," Vincent said quietly, snapping a loaded magazine into the grip. "We touch down in 20 minutes. I've got 2 SUVs waiting at the private hangar in Hillsborough. Local fixers provided the hardware." "Good," Sebastian replied, his voice devoid of any inflection. He slipped the photograph into his breast pocket close to his heart. "The address Madeline provided is a suburban house in Beaverton. We hit it fast. If Greco is there, we take him alive. I want him to look me in the eye before I end him." When they arrived at the address, a modest 2-story craftsman home on a quiet, tree-lined street, the rain was coming down in sheets. There were no lights on inside. The neighborhood was dead silent. It was the kind of crushing suburban quiet that made Sebastian's instincts scream. Sebastian and Vincent approached the front door, weapons drawn, flanked by 4 heavily armed men they had brought from Houston. Vincent tested the doorknob. It was unlocked. The wood around the deadbolt was splintered. Sebastian's heart seized. He kicked the door open, his gun sweeping the dark entryway. The house had been torn apart. Furniture was overturned, upholstery slashed, and picture frames shattered across the hardwood floor. In the kitchen, a half-eaten bowl of cereal sat on the counter, the milk long spoiled. They were too late. "Clear the rooms," Vincent barked, fanning the men out. Sebastian walked slowly into the living room, his boots crunching on broken glass. He saw a child's drawing pinned to the refrigerator. It was a crude, colorful crayon sketch of a boy, a woman, and a dog. Below it, in uneven letters, was the name Leo. Sebastian reached out, his trembling fingers grazing the paper. A fresh wave of fury threatened to drown him. "Sebastian," Vincent called out from the hallway. "In here." Sebastian moved swiftly to a small office at the back of the house. Vincent was kneeling beside a heavy oak desk. The floorboards beneath it had been pried up, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small metal lockbox, identical in make to the one the lawyer had brought to Sebastian's penthouse. "It's keyed," Vincent noted, pointing to the brass lock. Sebastian pulled the single brass key from his pocket. He knelt down, inserted it into the lock, and turned. The box clicked open. Inside wasn't money or passports, but a single folded map of the Oregon coastline. A red circle was drawn around a remote marina in Astoria, near the mouth of the Columbia River. Scribbled in the margin in Madeline's frantic handwriting were 3 words: Pier 4, the Albatross. Before Sebastian could speak, a heavy thud echoed from the second floor, followed by the sound of breaking glass. "We got a rat," one of Sebastian's men shouted from upstairs. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed space. Sebastian and Vincent sprinted up the stairs. In the master bedroom, one of Greco's hired guns, a hulking man in a leather jacket, was bleeding from a gunshot wound to the shoulder. He was pinned to the floor by 2 of Sebastian's soldiers. Sebastian walked over to the bleeding man, his face a mask of terrifying calm. He recognized the man, Russo, an old street soldier who used to run numbers for Uncle Albert. "Where is he, Russo?" Sebastian asked softly, crouching down. "Where is Thomas Greco?" Russo spat a wad of blood onto the carpet, grinning through shattered teeth. "You're too late, Falcone. Greco tracked the sister here 2 days ago. They ran, but he pushed them to the coast. He's got them cornered at some rusty boat graveyard in Astoria. He's going to gut the kid, Dom, just like Albert wanted." Sebastian didn't blink. He stood up, leveled his Glock at Russo's kneecap, and pulled the trigger. Russo's agonizing scream echoed through the empty house. "Vincent," Sebastian said coldly, turning his back on the writhing man. "Call the pilot. Tell him to have the engines running. Then get the cars. We're going to Astoria." The Astoria Marina was a graveyard of rusting fishing trawlers and rotting wooden docks. It was shrouded in a dense, freezing fog that rolled off the Pacific Ocean. The smell of salt, decay, and diesel fuel hung heavy in the air. Sebastian's SUVs rolled to a stop at the edge of the gravel lot, cutting their headlights. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, but the wind howled through the masts of the dead ships like tortured spirits. "Pier 4, Vincent whispered, pointing through the fog. At the end of the dilapidated wooden pier sat a massive rusted commercial fishing boat. It had the faded name the Albatross painted on its hull. A faint yellow light glowed from the captain's cabin. "I go first," Sebastian ordered, chambering around. "No one fires unless I give the word. If Greco dies before I say so, the man who shot him answers to me. Understood?" The men nodded grimly. They moved like ghosts along the slick wooden planks of the pier. As they approached the Albatross, Sebastian could hear the sound of Greco's voice echoing from the deck. A cruel, raspy drawl that made Sebastian's blood boil. Sebastian signaled for his men to flank the vessel. He climbed the rusted metal ladder on the side of the boat, hauling himself over the railing with silent, deadly grace. He crouched behind a stack of rotting crab pots, peering into the glow of the deck lights. There, tied to a metal winch in the center of the deck, was a woman with disheveled blonde hair, her face bruised and bleeding. Chloe, Madeline's sister. She was breathing heavily, staring with pure hatred at the man pacing in front of her. Thomas the butcher. Greco was a gaunt, imposing figure with dead, hollow eyes and a cruel scar running down his neck. He held a heavy silver revolver, casually spinning the cylinder. But it was what was behind Greco that made Sebastian's heart stop. Huddled in the corner against the cabin wall, clutching a dirty blanket, was a little boy, Leo. He was terrified, his large brown eyes wide with tears, but he wasn't crying out. He had Madeline's chin, but the stoic, fierce defiance in his gaze. That was all Sebastian. "I'm going to ask you one last time, Chloe," Greco snarled, grabbing the woman by her hair and pulling her head back. "Where did your sister hide the ledger? Albert knew she took insurance. Give me the files and I'll make the boy's death quick." "Go to hell," Chloe spat, blood dripping from her lip. "Sebastian Falcone is going to rip you to pieces." Greco laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Sebastian doesn't even know this brat exists. He's back in Houston counting his money, completely oblivious that his empire is built on the bones of his dead whore." Greco. The voice sliced through the fog, colder than the ocean wind. Greco froze. He slowly turned around. Sebastian stepped out from the shadows of the crab pots, his gun raised, aiming directly at the center of Greco's forehead. At the same moment, Vincent and the 4 Houston enforcers vaulted over the railings, instantly surrounding Greco with a wall of tactical rifles. For a second, the legendary butcher of Houston looked genuinely terrified. Sebastian Greco stammered, taking a step back. How did you? A letter, Sebastian said, his voice trembling with a rage so deep it felt volcanic. Delivered 5 years too late, but right on time for you. Greco's eyes darted frantically, calculating his odds. Finding none, a sick, desperate smile spread across his face. He suddenly lunged toward the corner. He grabbed Leo by the collar of his jacket and hauled the screaming boy up, pressing the barrel of his revolver to the child's temple. "Drop the guns," Greco screamed, using the boy as a shield. "Drop them, or I'll blow his brains out right here, Falcone. I swear to God I will." "No, Leo!" Chloe shrieked, struggling against her ropes. Sebastian's blood ran cold. The sight of the metal gun pressed against his son's fragile head sent a shockwave of raw terror through him. But he was a Falcone. He was the boss of the underworld. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. "Let him go, Thomas," Sebastian said softly, lowering his weapon an inch. "You want to walk out of here alive? Hand me the boy. You walk away. You disappear. You think I'm stupid?" Greco spat, backing toward the edge of the boat. "Albert gave me an order. The Falcone bloodline ends here. But maybe we make a deal. You let me on a boat out of here, and I leave the kid on the dock." "Deal," Sebastian said instantly. Greco smirked, believing he had the upper hand. He began to shuffle sideways toward the gangplank, dragging the crying child with him. "You always were too soft, Dom, just like Albert said. A real boss would have shot through the kid to get to me." "You're right," Sebastian whispered. "A real boss would." Sebastian didn't hesitate. He didn't blink. In a fraction of a second, his arm snapped up, and he squeezed the trigger. Crack! The bullet tore through the misty air and struck Greco perfectly in his right eye. The enforcer's head snapped back violently, a spray of crimson painting the white fog. Greco's body went completely rigid. His finger slipped off the trigger of his revolver before he collapsed backward over the railing. He plummeted into the dark, freezing waters of the Columbia River with a heavy splash. Silence fell over the boat, save for the sound of the churning water. Sebastian dropped his gun. He sprinted across the deck. He fell to his knees beside the little boy, who was now staring in shock at the spot where Greco had just been standing. Sebastian choked out, his voice cracking. He reached out with trembling hands. The boy looked at him. His dark, tear-filled eyes studied Sebastian's face. He looked at Sebastian's eyes, then down at his own hands, sensing a strange, unspoken connection. Are you the man from the stories?" Leo whispered, his voice tiny and fragile. "My mom told me stories about a king in a tall tower. She said he loved us very much." A tear slipped down Sebastian's cheek, the first he had shed in half a decade. He pulled the boy into his chest, wrapping his massive arms around his son, burying his face in Leo's dark hair. He breathed in the scent of him, feeling the small, rapidly beating heart against his own. The ghost of Madeleine Hayes was finally laid to rest, but the legacy of her love was alive, warm, and breathing in his arms. "Yes," Sebastian whispered fiercely, kissing the top of the boy's head as Vincent moved to cut Chloe free. "I'm that man, and I'm never ever letting you go." Sebastian stood up holding his son securely against his hip. He looked over the rusted railing, staring out into the pitch-black ocean. Houston would be in ashes by the time he returned. The traitors would be dead, the old guard wiped out, and a new empire would be built from the rubble. Not an empire of shadows and secrets, but an impenetrable fortress of blood and iron. He was Sebastian Falcone, the boss, and heaven help anyone who ever tried to touch his son again.